Hello, and welcome to Joe's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical, with me, your host, and your resident art historian, Joe McLaughlin. Welcome back. It is episode 54 and the final episode of season 2 of Joe's Art History Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me so far throughout the season, and we're going out with a bit of a bang today. My guest today is art dealer Will Jarvis, and today Will and I are going to be taking a bit of a deep dive / whistle stop tour on the history of art patronage. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a little while, you'll know that I'm completely fascinated with the history of the art market and particularly art dealers. So when Will wrote to me to suggest that we discuss the history of art patronage throughout time, I thought it was a great idea and jumped on the opportunity. So this will be a 2-part special where Will and I will discuss 5 key stages of art creation / patronage and the rise of making art accessible, taking you from cave paintings right through to contemporary patronage. The first half of this podcast, part 1, will be released today, and part 2 will be released shortly after. I really hope you enjoy it. It's a fantastic conversation, very sort of open in terms of structure and sharing of ideas, and I really loved recording this and listening back to it. So thank you once again to Will for being such a fabulous guest. So just sit back and relax for part 1 of Will Jarvis and I discussing the history of art patronage. So I think for me, when we previously spoke before we hit record about potentially doing this episode about the history of patronage, it's
Yeah.
something that I'm really fascinated about because, as you know, I've got a little bit of an obsession with art dealers throughout art history and their role within driving the art market through, because I think there's so many people there's so many great dealers behind the scenes and people and movements and institutions that have been so completely crucial in driving art and shaping art history in the way that it looks today. And I thought it was really interesting when you suggested this, because I was like, yes, that's perfect. And it really ties in beautifully as well to what you do with Gertrude and your own sort of work that you do in the art world. But when did you first start get interested in the whole history of patronage and the idea around the art of dealing?
Yeah, I guess for us, when we first began the gallery, it was an artist-led project space. This is the gallery, The Sunday Painter. And as we kind of moved towards becoming a commercial gallery and representing artists and trying to deal work, essentially, we realized that we didn't fit the conventional mold of who an art dealer is, what background they come from, who their connections are. So I did a lot of research in those early days to try and understand and potentially kind of, I guess, reshape myself a little bit in order to be able to play the role better. So, yeah, reading Joseph Devine's book, that was very kind of formative and very, very interesting. And then also Leo Castelli's book about his circle. So there was a few things, and also even City Racing. City Racing was very inspirational when we first began the gallery as a project space. They had an amazing book that was very rough and ready and very entertaining. So it was kind of in that vein, and then it's just been further. It's come into focus further now that we're looking at what we're doing with Gertrude, which is essentially trying to further democratize art, not the art world, but art, and also understanding, I guess, what that means and understanding what ownership means and thinking about, something that always occurs to me is that, especially with something like art, which bar you burning it down intentionally, it's kind of going to last beyond you or your generation. It means that you're essentially just a temporary custodian of that art. So that kind of throws this notion of ownership into a different sphere. which is interesting. And even, I guess, recent research in, I'm going to say that what heinous word that I think people are going to shudder, NFTs, because everyone's sick of hearing and reading about them. And also a lot of the actual content or the cultural product of NFTs at this stage is very, very poor. But the mechanics behind and around the NFT and what it could mean for people is very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of custodianship, and really because you're a sort of temporary owner of art, really. And you're just one in a long line of people that have had the pleasure of owning something, or if you're the first person to own it out of an artist studio, it's that nice idea of sort of passing it on and sort of having a lineage that you have then started by supporting a contemporary artist. And it's always kind of been that way. So the whole point of this episode is we're going to do really like a whistle stop tour of the history of patronage of art and within the art world. And we wanted to sort of point out a couple of things for the listeners as we went along. This is very much this is a humongous topic. This could be a podcast in itself. And I definitely think you and I were very sort of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, like, yeah, we'll just, because we had 5 points that were like, yeah, we'll just fly through them all. But they're also important and also integral pieces of the machine that helps the other one move along. But I think in terms of giving a brief overview of why the art world sort of ticks the way that it does, or what things that have happened and changed, is really fascinating. And it's something that you don't really, unless you sort of move in the art world circles, give it a lot of thought to, in terms of how works were moved around, sold, created, how even an artwork has ended up in a museum, or like an object has ended up in a museum, and why that is considered important and within the context where it sits. So there's so many ways we can take this podcast. And there's something else that you said that you wanted to really sort of flag up, is it's very much going to be based on Western art history. Not to say that there isn't other fabulous things going on in the world, but it's just everything that was very much within reach, within our sort of time frame, was all around Western art. So there's lots and lots of things that are happening all over the world while we're discussing these things as well, but we're going to sort of concentrate on Western art. And this is actually, it's the first time I've done a podcast where I've not used images as like as a springboard. So I'm interested to see where this is going to go. So we thought really actually you had suggested the best place to start really was kind of the first examples of man making art, which is prehistoric, and it's cave paintings.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just, before we begin right here, I guess something that I think we'll find throughout this whole, charging through time and looking at this subject in relation to it, something that I think will really stand out to us is realizing that patronage is participation, and that from the very beginning of cave art, those that supported the kind of artists and the artistry were absolutely important and really contributed something that nothing's in isolation. We might have fantasies and kind of cliched ideas around artists operating in isolation, but they never really do. Not the stuff that kind of bubbles up and connects to us. So yeah, cave art, that's, in a literal sense, there's groups, there's tribal groups, and they're essentially supporting the artistry through hunting or kind of foraging on behalf of the artist and enabling them to spend time kind of delving into their craft.
Yeah, I'd never even actually thought of it like that. And something I said to you before we hit record is, essentially, when you're dealing with cave paintings, it actually poses more questions than what it does provide answers. And it's been really interesting to read about the history, and that there's so many examples of cave paintings. Particularly, I think I read in National Geographic, between Spain and France, there's over 400 caves that they've found that have these incredible paintings. So really for our UK listeners, really not too crazy far from where we are at the moment. And they're just filled with stories of these tribes. And it was obviously just what you've said there really brilliantly. They were obviously important within the tribe because they were left to do this task as others went out and provided. So it shows that everyone had a role in society, or a job, if you will, an important skill that contributed in some way to the community. And perhaps the artists that worked in these cave paintings were in themselves contributing to kind of almost like prehistoric graffiti, really. Perhaps it was a way of like marking territory, or
could be. I also think, like, looking at the site itself, I think that holds some interesting points, which is this: there's a spiritual dimension to a lot of the cave art. It feels like there's a spiritual dimension. It feels like in order to get in deep enough where you've got a kind of sensory deprivation, and you've got this old air, and and lots of these works are layered on top of each other. So you've got this understanding of time, probably for the first time in a kind of human mind, that there's this lineage dating back, and you can kind of physically touch and connect with it. And also, we don't really know the role that it played, but you can imagine from looking at a lot of them that there's such a kind of powerful mysticism surrounding these works that you could imagine some kind of ritualistic or kind of some kind of performance things that went in parallel to the creation of them, or the celebration of them, or the reflection of life. They're really, really remarkable. And just on literal sense, they were often, I think there was two types, which is there's more of the figurative drawings of animals, and then there's kind of abstract and geometric signs and kind of numbering, and that feels like proxy language. But we're not really equipped to really understand it, because we're so from our kind of Homo sapien of this era lens that it feels hard. But I guess for me, there were some interesting things that I thought about, because I found 32 signs across an entire continent, and it's things like an asterisk, a circle, crosshatch, and like a cross, a line, like all of these basic things. But actually, lots of those things are playing massive roles in our life today, like a crucifix or a hashtag. Like, these are actually, within your fingertips. We have a lineage dating back, or a visual language that dates back so far, that potentially has been with us. I don't know. It just kind of makes the mind boggle.
It really does, and it's something that I've never really sort of stopped and really given thought to, because I had read as well that there was symbols in these caves, and they seemed to think that this was a way of languages, or it was signifiers that the tribes would understand. It was a way of recording events and things that had happened. And it's bizarre that it's art has always been a way of communicating. And even in its most basic stripped back form, mixing minerals and water from the earth and putting it on cave walls, and even where they, in the depths in which some of these caves, the sort of art seeps into, is something in itself mind-boggling and mystical. And you just think, what were they doing down here? Like, what was it? Why this place? Why this cave? What are they trying to say? And it's, again, going back to what we said earlier, there's just so many more questions than what it gives you answers. For me, what it made me think about was the artist that made this. Was this a skill that was passed on? Was it only certain people in the tribe that were trained? Were the skills of how to mix minerals, and in what proportion you mix minerals? Because really, they're black and reds. To get the same consistency, they surely would have had some understanding of alchemy in a way, to what proportion of water to whatever, how you grind things down. Really, when you start to break it down like that, really until sort of the 19th century, how you made paint really didn't kind of progress any further until they started sort of providing things in tubes for you, because people like Leonardo, of course, had to grind his own paints down and things like that. So for me, there's such a link back to everything in these caves, and it's just I'm kind of lost.
It is a remarkable subject, and as you say, the more that this whole thing's revealed, the more you learn, the less you know. It's like there's just vast plateaus of our knowledge that we're yet to kind of grasp. But I think also there's something about Neanderthals potentially participated as well, and I think that's really interesting. And I think I heard this remarkable fact a while ago, which is that Neanderthals didn't actually become extinct. We bred with them, and that there's 75% of Neanderthal genome exists within our genome, and each of us is roughly 2.5% Neanderthal. And so that, when you're thinking of all of these categories of this, I think humanity has a tendency to kind of separate itself from nature and not understand that we're part of a kind of continual link or connection, because we don't have these sapient cousins around anymore. But they have actually, they are here, they're within us, and they were participating in this emerging kind of culture thousands of years ago. Another thing that I found quite interesting is that there's basically trends, but they're glacially paced trends. So you'll get like hands, for example, were most popular between 25 and 40,000 BC, and then they fade out by the end of the last ice age. So, and then there's different signs or forms come in and out. So I could see it as like a super delayed kind of glacial paced trend that's being passed through. Yeah, because I think things, like how all of our culture kind of moves is like we're passing it on constantly, and it's morphing as it goes, and it's kind of oscillating in and out. Things are oscillating in and out of relevancy or interest.
It's so fascinating. But even when you were saying there about the hands, I was thinking, well, yeah, that makes complete sense, because I've got nephews, and what my favorite thing to do is to draw around their hand. Like it's you leaving your mark on the earth. And I suppose that I don't know, for me, I find when I've seen images of sort of cave paintings of people's hands, I find it really playful, and that they're experimenting with things and building a mural collectively, even though that of course would not have been the word that what it was, but it's I don't know.
It's also strangely meta, because it's like it's the hand that enables us to do it. These opposable thumbs and being able to stand up is kind of what separates us and allows us all of this creative potential. So it's almost like a homage to the thing that allows the thing.
Yeah, true. No, that's so true. Beautifully put, actually. Yeah, wow. It's something that I feel there needs to be, that there could be a whole episode on cave art in itself, really. It's just so fascinating. But going back to the symbols a little bit, when I was reading about that for me then completely clinked with another sort of very civilized and very, very important civilization within within history, and of course art history, which was the Egyptians, which is of course thousands of years later. But I love the idea that symbols were such a huge important part of their society. But I wondered in cave, for me, something that as an art historian now, when I speak to people that haven't studied art history, or people always say to me like, oh, I have no idea about paintings, I don't know about the symbolism and things like that. What I find interesting is, in terms of cave painting, is that the tribes probably would have known what all these things meant. So it was a communal language. It wasn't sort of kept for one group of society, or like, oh no, we're the artists, we're the ones that understand all this. Everybody could engage with these works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think also in you can see today in some Aboriginal cave art that a lot of it is actually super instructional. It's saying like, over there, this many paces to the right at the haggard tree, and there's your water. It's kind of, there are some that are super instructional. I guess something that I was also chewing over is, are these kind of forms, are they kind of archetypes? Are they visual archetypes that are starting to kind of seed in our kind of collective consciousness? You know, things that we have an innate connection and knowing of, because they're just, yeah, a half circle, a crosshatch. These are things that are so simple. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to digest.
Well, that's it. And the thing is that there is no right or wrong answer, because really nobody knows, like coming back to it, nobody knows why these are here, what the purpose of them were.
Yeah.
But it's all just speculation. And for me, it's really blown my mind in terms of how many questions, and why I've never asked these questions, why I've never actually given myself 10 minutes to sit down and really think about what these things mean, and really how they've got there. And in terms of even what you said about an artist having his job and everyone else sort of going out and having their own sort of role to play in a tribe, has never crossed my mind before. I just assumed everybody did the same thing, but again, sort of breaks down that everybody in a community has their own role to play and help move, and that art is an important part of that community. And I think that's something that, as we move through, we'll see art is always an important commodity. Art is something that connects people, and then eventually it becomes this thing which elevates people, and it's very much sort of cut out, and it's the thing that either is instructional, such as when it's in churches and cathedrals, or it tells visitors to courts that they're in the presence of someone that is incredibly important, because they can afford this
incredibly powerful propaganda. For
the
most part, that's how it's been used. Even back, back in the era of cave art, this potentially is the beginning of where kind of superstition, probably starts, within us. And these, I think the potential for it being, it's a soft power, but it's a significant power, and it really can. This is why, I mean, even you get people that go to an art fair and take a photograph of themselves in front of an artwork, and it's this kind of virtual signaling. It's like there's a power in the association.
Yeah,
that's just the same as, essentially, it's like buying a work and being kind of living with it adorned in your house, or having a, I guess, painting of you made, or they're all different tones of the same act, which is to kind of prop up or enforce a sense of self in a weird way, or an agenda. Often it's an agenda.
Because I mean, the art that you keep says so much about you, and even if I think of my friends, and if I visit their houses, what they have on their walls, I've got some friends that are massive gamers, and all the walls are limited edition prints, or they've had things commissioned by artists that specifically deal with games. Or I've got people that love anime, and their houses are completely filled with things of Japanese and anime influence. It does tell you something, and it tells you, going back to the cave painting, it tells you something about these things that were important enough that it was someone's job to record them, be that the beasts they hunted, how the tribe killed and hunted and gathered, and even sometimes where they eventually left, or why they left. I don't know, like
totally. Some of it was major projects as well. I think Lascaux Cave. Some of these were huge projects with multiple craftspeople essentially participating, and also this idea of, there's a real awareness of the cave as material itself, and the kind of manipulation of the physical wall, the selecting of the right spot to kind of further bring to life the scenes that were drawn on them, using the shapes and the forms to kind of emphasize certain kind of drawn parts. But like Lascaux Cave, that was a huge undertaking.
It's just incredible. And some of these caves, I mean, I think one of the oldest caves is in Indonesia, and it dates back sort of 60,000 years. They found things that date 65,000 years was one of the things that I read. But I read a really interesting thing where it was talking about cave art, and then the shift from sort of prehistoric, obviously prehistoric and Egyptian are still in the same bracket, but when they sort of switch into a more civilized or understanding of what a civilized society is in terms of the Egyptians, that the cave art gives people a real world view. So it's talking about, it's depicting things that are happening in real life. And then there's this switch all of a sudden to an unrealistic view. If you look at people like the Egyptians, they were showing you, it was all about reminding people that the gods ruled them and that pharaohs ruled them and that they were inferior and all these things would happen to them if they don't obey the rules. So it gives, so there's a switch in.
Well, I mean, in some senses, it's always been kind of, it's manipulated by the status quo.
Yeah,
that's it's to kind of implement and maintain a social order. It's often been used in that way. It's probably still being used in that way in some senses.
I think modern day there's certain ilks of art that are being produced that perhaps aren't, and people are finding more and more ways to sort of celebrate their individuality, and that reflects in art that they can find, which we'll get onto. But it definitely, art is something throughout time that has been used to show status, to show, essentially dictate the rules. And by all points, particularly the church, strike fear into people into behaving. And because people were illiterate, but everyone visually knew what these stories were because they were passed on word of mouth, and they could follow stories along. And I think it's really interesting that that's what art has been used for centuries and centuries, is to tell stories and essentially dictate to people how they should and should not live their lives.
Totally. I mean, I think about, like, imagine the psyche of like a peasant that works in the field like all day, and they go home and they've got their tiny hut, and then they go to this church and it's tall and thin. There's this orchestral music, there are these choir boys, there's these, amazing kind of ornate carved decor and these incredible paintings. I mean, that's going to bowl you over. You're gonna kind of submit to this force. You're going to believe in it. It might lift you up, but it might also punish you. It has all of that kind of transcribed in the physical space.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I enter some of these spaces now in the day and age of having Netflix and Instagram and all sorts of things at my fingertips, never mind, and I'm bowled over now, so I can't even imagine what it must have been like for people who they lived and died by what these places dictated to them. So it's I think people have to remember, for there's a large section, essentially the Renaissance, a large section of Renaissance art is all around the church and patrons and things like that. But let's move on from the cave paintings. And for me, again, the next sort of shift for me was looking, as I've said a few times, at the Egyptians, and that really was a lovely sort of link for me into the sort of real world view and then into the unrealistic view. And there were so many, like, they really got creative. It moved on from paintings, people started carving, people started using ceramics, and this is something that I really found interesting. The materials that people used as the sort of prehistoric and sort of moved into medieval are materials that we still use today, and particularly precious materials like lapis lazuli. Like the Egyptians, this was a really sort of coveted material because it had heavenly associations. It was something that it was very scarce. It was very expensive to get hold of, and it's exactly the same today. Something like lapis lazuli is a material that is still like, it's got very historic and important symbolism behind it as well. So really what researching for this has showed me is art has come on in so many ways, and yet it hasn't really, because we're using the same things. I mean, I had a really lovely time just sort of looking through, particularly the British Museum, looking at some of the things that, they've got beautiful sort of carved wood altar pieces and figurines, and then they've got bone, they've got ceramics and things like that. It's iron, gold, silver. Yeah, it's incredible. And again, but these things were not commissioned, but and these were made by craftspeople, because this is something I'd never really thought about before. Who made all the art in places like this? They had places where people were trained up to be craftsmen, and it wasn't as if you had a head craftsman. But what I read was, in the time of the Egyptians, for example, it didn't matter who the artist was. Everybody worked as a collective. Everybody worked regardless of sort of skill and ability. Everybody worked together, because the collective, it wasn't about one person's ability to create something beautiful. It was about the collective passing on a message and making sure that realistically a pharaoh was ready for the afterlife and serving a different purpose. So that for me,
it's much, that is quite fascinating. It's much more kind of definitive. It's the default, but that feels like that's like life under a dictator as well. It's like, and that's what you have today. Like our art and artists are some of the first people to be censored, because they have the potential to kind of rally and to draw out emotion and to inspire. And so therefore often it's, dictatorships that need to kind of take control of this and to control the message, control what's communicated. But yeah, it is fascinating to see, I guess, a relatively cohesive narrative coming from the past. And I guess in another way, what we value in contemporary artists today is the opposite of that. We value that. We value independent thought, independent kind of pursuit within the artist's practice. But in a weird way, that's just mirroring the ism of the day, which is this is liberal humanism. We celebrate every individual has the right to pursue their own happiness, and that when we enshrine those rights. And so in a weird way, the artist is just a reflection of our culture today, as they were a reflection of the Egyptian culture back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. The point is really that art is still an important aspect running throughout these communities, and it's something that you could get involved with, and if you wanted to, you can go into a workshop and train. And that's something that, again, continue even to this day. It doesn't matter where you come from. You can go to art school and you can train and you can leave your mark in some way. It's so funny how we've not really.
It's not hugely different.
No, it's not. The system's the same. Like which I'm finding so interesting. We'll leave the Egyptians behind and we'll talk about, realistically, I think the biggest patrons and the people that really have had the biggest input in shaping the art world in sort of medieval and Renaissance times, and that is courts, kings, and what we've kind of chimed as the art of praise. So for people listening, what is the art of praise essentially? Who are these people?
I don't know if I'm well versed enough. I was just going to say that that I think with the Renaissance we start to see the beginning of class and social systems, and this emerging middle class who are merchants, and their ability to quite adeptly use art as leverage. Not only was it a way of creating their own PR, but also like patronizing on behalf of a certain religious order will push you up the rankings socially. So that's quite an interesting thing. But yeah, I mean, how would you summarize? I don't know how I would summarize. How would you summarize the art of praise? Or
art of praise, I would just say it's the leaders, and very much like you said, the merchant classes, people that essentially had wealth. And really, this is the first time, for me anyway, that I can see art being used as a thing that dictates and causes fear, and is something that is only allowed to the select few that have the means to create it. and engage with it, because things like museums and an art market, if you will, in the way that we know it, didn't really exist. So people, really the only people that had the means to consume and commission were those of great wealth. So, and of course that's the church. And the most, people sort of lived and died by the church, as we've said previously. So it made complete sense, and this is where all their money and taxes used to go to. So it makes sense that for so many hundreds of years, the vast majority of things in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it's all based around religious stories, biblical stories, biblical teachings, parables, important patrons, saints. And really, it's kind of the first time that I can remember seeing people that commission these things, patrons, someone who goes to an artist and pays, can also, it's kind of like they can buy their way into heaven. This is kind of
they can buy access.
Yeah,
they can buy a position. I mean, it's also interesting. It feels like there's the cousin of art is craft, and that they're intrinsically linked, but one is, I mean, even today, like, one is looked up to and one is kind of frowned upon. But they're kind of the same thing, and they are, they reinforce each other. But art has become, and was back then, this aspired to thing, this powerful tool, sometimes a weapon, sometimes something that could seduce, that was kind of wielded by individuals with agendas.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to put it, individuals with agendas, because that's exactly what it was. And I think for a lot of people, they don't really realize it. When someone says to me a court artist, when I was a student, someone like, if they're in a court of a king or a wealthy sort of merchant family in Florence, very important artist. And you kind of think, I don't really think I know anybody, but actually anybody who is of note was a court painter. So for example, Michelangelo was a court painter, and someone like Leonardo da Vinci was a court painter as well. So these huge big names that really we know their works because they were commissioned by the best families going. But this is what I find really interesting about sort of the Renaissance, sort of medieval art, particularly the Renaissance in sort of Italy, sort of Florence and Milan, is when people commissioned artists. So just take it back a little bit. So today, somebody like Damien Hirst, people sort of ruffle their feathers and say, oh, he's got a studio full of artists like this, and he just has the idea and everybody else executes it. It's not art. He can't call himself an artist. But that's exactly what these people did. There was no art dealers. Patrons would go to artists. Or, for example, if a wealthy patron visited the court of a king and saw that some artist in the region had painted a portrait of the king, they would then find the name, and as a way of showing their loyalty, would find that artist and then commission a copy for it to happen, as a way of sort of buying favor and letting people know that you are a loyal supporter of what's going on, of your ruler and what's happening in your community. But artists back then also had humongous studios, and they would sit down with their patron one-on-one and say, okay, well, I will paint 25%, 30%, I will paint the face and the hands, and I'll maybe do a bit of the robes, and then everything else my studio assistants would do. And they would sign a contract and say, okay, great, have it completed by that date. And that's what they would do. So it's, I read a really fabulous book. It's called, I think it's The Art in 15th Century Italy. And it's this tiny, tiny little book. It's maybe like 95 pages long. And it's it details how artists went about procuring contracts with clients or pay what we call them. Interesting. And it's such a fascinating history, because again, it's not really moved on from what it does today.
It sounds, to be honest, it sounds more organized.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot more professional, if you ask me.
Well,
I like the idea of
I think
artists producing work on time. That'd be
yeah.
great. But I think another interesting thing that popped up to me is this idea that, like, we've actually, you can take that criticism to a big named artist like Damien Hirst and say, they don't touch the work, da 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 da. And then you can cite these great masters who essentially did the same. But actually, contemporary artists today, at least they have their own ideas. So these
Yeah.
other artists that might be looked up to and held in high regard because of their physical talent at painting or whatever, ultimately they weren't. These were given to them. Not that the ideas were given to them, but the subject was given to them. That the parameters for them to kind of really operate and communicate and kind of discuss things was hugely limited by the subject matter because they're essentially fulfilling the agenda of another person. Whereas today, that is something that we really value. The fact that artists are having these ideas and pursuing them, and that's, there's a lot of wealth there in terms of ideas because we can appreciate all the way from the material and how it's been kind of used, or the materials have been executed or created, all the way up to kind of their conceptual placing. And so there's a whole range of areas that we can weave in and out of, and different tones that can become different tones and different combinations that can become really kind of intoxicating to us. Whereas actually a lot of the art through the ages has functioned as a backdrop to kind of quite dictatorial terms put on by whichever person can pay the bill.
No, and you're completely right. And some of the best works of art in the world, like Da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan, that was commissioned. He was told, this is what I want you to paint. He didn't just turn up and think, oh, do you know what, a fancy painting? You're completely right. And it's a really, really important point. People were completely limited because patronage was so important and these materials were so expensive, and people didn't have the freedom and access to things that we do today. If you want to paint something, you can pop to a shop like Tiger and pick up a little set of paints and brushes for £2 or £3. It wasn't that case all those years ago. There was meticulous training rounds that you could go through, and it was expensive to fulfill for these things. But ultimately, why these things were being commissioned was to, one, show power and buy favor and show that I am holier than thou. There's when I was at university, I had a seminar group that was looking at manuscripts, particularly sort of privately commissioned Bibles for people that traveled. So wives of merchants who would travel around the country, they would commission these portable Bibles that were beautifully illustrated. And the whole point, essentially, the more illustrated it was, the more it showed your wealth when you stopped over the night somewhere and when you prayed. But it also showed, essentially, the more elaborate things were, the more devoted it showed that you were.
But that's quite ironic because obviously the Bible at the time was also, the religious.
Yeah.
The dominant religions at the time were also saying it's easier for a rich man to get. It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven, because they had because Christians weren't allowed to lend money, essentially. So there is this strange hypocrisy in this material regalia and pomp and buying your way in, but also being kind of weirdly frowned upon by the church. So it's kind of strange, I guess, because the Catholic Church was a major consumer and producer of material wealth. What was I going to say? I was going to say, we were talking a little bit earlier about Goya and talking about artists having significant limitations on what they actually produce. And I wonder how many artists actually produce work they wanted to produce that just didn't become famous or wasn't collected. Or
sketchbooks. Da Vinci sketchbooks are I spoke about this with someone else on a different podcast, actually, because and the podcast, for anyone listening, is called Is Drawing Important? And we spoke about certain artists that really believe that the crux of being a good painter and being able to push the medium forward is to really understand the basics and master painting, realistic painting and drawing, and then move it forward. And one of the examples we used was one of Da Vinci's sketchbooks, which was one of the pages was completely full of cat drawings. And they were just sketches of cats that he used to just let into his house. And they're fabulous and they're so playful. And I think maybe that's where an artist would have had time to
more freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of like anything, really. Like, where do you have the freedom to explore and express yourself and sort of push your style and your technique? Any artist that I know, it's their sketchbooks, or they have a whole series of drawings that are hidden away at the bottom of a drawer, and they're like, oh no, that's just playing. Like, don't look at that. Because I think that's just intrinsic of being an artist. Like, you have to create. There's no, some days you wake up and you be like, no, I can't be bothered doing anything today. But every artist that
there's a need.
There's a need. That's it. It's
an urge.
You have to scratch it. So, and I can't see artists ever not being like that. I mean, we could be completely wrong. Maybe the only time you were ever able, I mean, these, paper was so expensive and canvases and things like that. But, this is, I mean, I suppose a whole lot of Renaissance incredible paintings were painted on wood, actually. So panels, stuff like that as well. So there's lots of different materials I'm assuming people could have played with, and they wouldn't have been sketchbooks, I suppose, necessarily in the way that we knew them. But surely there's got to be scrap bits of paper and scrap bits of parchment that they could have sort of doodled on, if you will. And
yeah.
But it'd be interesting to know, like, how, because it's part of your development. It's part of your development as an artist to do all these things. But again, so many questions, Will, so many questions.
So little time. Terrible. A little note that I just found here that I'd written about patrons as influencers, which is that essentially, as we spoke about earlier, in terms of who's dictating what, they were in the position to kind of set fashions and style and subject matter, and also they did things like importing artists and artworks from distant lands to show off how kind of sophisticated they were and how they've traveled. And it's interesting, all these things that were quite egoic reflections of self that art ends up being.
No, absolutely. And that brings me on to an example that I know. So Philip of Spain, who was sort of around in the 1600s, Charles I went to visit him. Essentially, I think he was going to marry, so Charles I of England was potentially going to marry one of his daughters, and that didn't work out. But when he went to visit Philip, he was so enamored by the fact that he had a court painter. His court painter was Velasquez. And
wow.
He had this incredible collection that when Charles came back and said, oh, we've actually got hardly anything in the British Royal Collection, he then made it his mission.
Wow.
And he was so flamboyant in his spending, which is one of the reasons he was in a lot of trouble with Parliament and eventually led to his beheading. He then
that's commitment for you.
Yeah, well, that's it. Like, he's willing to die to build the collection. That he became so obsessed with trying to beat Philip IV in Spain that it just became this obsession to build the British collection, because he was so obsessed by it. And I think he's a really good example of someone that just loved collecting things. Like, it gave him a real buzz, and it wasn't necessarily it was to show that he was sophisticated and that he had style and that he was somebody to be looked up to in terms of his taste and his class, because he was very, very flamboyant in what he wore as well. But in terms of building a collection that he could enjoy and spew across the palaces, and I think he commissioned the most self-portraits of himself, something like that anyway.
Wow.
And he had I think it's a really famous Van Dyck painting that he, like you're talking about, working with artists abroad as well. He really loved, because Philip had said, oh, we've got some of the best sculptors that are in Rome. He'd commissioned this, it's a very famous 3-side portrait. So it's a portrait of the king, but you see him from his left side, front face full on, and then to the right side.
Wow.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful portrait. It's actually, I think the copy is in Windsor Castle. The copy's in the Royal Collection, but I think either a copy or maybe the original is at Windsor Castle. And he sent this incredible painting to Rome just so the person that he had commissioned to make a bust of him would have the best representation of what he looked like without him physically having to travel there. So to use to use painting, and then essentially after he was done, he was like, oh, you can just chuck the portrait if you want, we don't need it back.
Wow, that's true decadence, isn't it?
Isn't it? Well, no wonder he got beheaded. He loved that. He didn't listen to anybody else. But it's just so interesting how there's a switch all of a sudden from the art of commissioning religion and then sort of religious subjects and trying to buy your way in, and then it became this status symbol. It's that, you know, your art collection was a way of telling people around you that you were incredibly wealthy. Not only that you were wealthy, but you had good taste. And this is where, for me, it gets really interesting.
I was just going to say, it's also quite interesting thinking that actually, obviously, before photographs, these were the only ways to really kind of communicate what someone looks like before meeting them in advance. So obviously, there's so many cases, so many stories of people having beautiful portraits painted of them, and then perhaps they don't quite look like the image. But
Hans Holbein and Henry VIII's fourth wife, Catherine of Cleves, very famously. Supposed to be this beauty, and Hans Holbein kind of went out and thought, oh gosh, I'll spruce it up a bit. Kind of really essentially the first sort of photoshopping of the day. It's just so interesting. But even portraiture in terms of spreading messages, I used to volunteer at a National Trust property in Glasgow. And funnily enough, it's got a really great Spanish art collection. And at the top of one of the staircases in the house was a portrait of a baby sort of wrapped up. And I said to one of the volunteers on one of my first days, I was like, oh, can you tell me about this painting? And they said, so have a look at the baby and what can you tell? Can you tell me anything about it? And I said, well, you know, it's really sort of decadent. It's, you know, it's wrapped in this very sort of decadent blanket. It's got all these, you know, beautiful headdresses. So it's a royal baby. And what it was actually painted for was the Queen had given birth, but the baby was a stillborn.
Wow.
And this was commissioned because the king was off fighting somewhere, and it was commissioned as proof that she had given birth.
Wow.
The baby was dead. And that's what they used to do that with kings and portraits as well. So people, obviously, not everybody could get to meet the king or see the king in the way that we do today because of photography and how easily we can access information. And what they used to do was commission a royal portrait, and then it would tour the towns so people would know what their king looked like. So it was a really important piece of propaganda and making people feel like, oh, this is what our king looks like. So it was really important that when people did commission these things, that they were seen in their best gear, their sort of Sunday best, if you will. And it's just, portraiture is so interesting, and how it was used as propaganda and getting people on side, and also how they did even bad news to each other.
That was just making me think of the death mask, and then that in turn thinking about memento mori. It's like no wonder that there's a whole kind of macabre vein in art that's about all these kind of fleeting and the kind of, I guess, mementos of death or the dead, the recently deceased. And I guess that's always been, I guess art's always been kind of considering mortality, hasn't it? From the cave paintings going back to this consciousness of time passing, and then all the way to kind of playing such a prominent role in communicating lives, marriages, deaths.
Yeah. But also it's, you know, you can come from whatever background, you can be rich, poor, you know, born in England, born on the other side of the world, whatever, but there's two events that will that everyone goes through, and that's birth and death. Everybody can't escape.
Yeah.
So it's so important that, and like you said, there's that whole memento mori macabre aspect of art history where they really did love reminding you that you were going to die one day. And yeah, it's an interesting tool.
Well, that was part of why it was so powerful at all, wasn't it, really? That, like, if you can kind of present this terrifying image of where you might end up if you don't follow the rules, it can really kind of keep people in line.
But what's interesting is, again, these works would have been commissioned by a patron, not necessarily the church, perhaps a private patron, perhaps a royal household, somebody of great wealth. And yeah, there seems to, like, particularly moving through sort of 16th, 17th century, there seems to be like a diversification in terms of subject matter. It's not solely religious subjects anymore. It's battle scenes, it's beautiful bouquets, it's still life, it's hunt scenes, it's all these different things that kind of show off a person's interests and talents and, I don't know, curiosities, if you will. And then that whole idea of cabinets of curiosities as well, that way of collecting weird and wonderful objects from all over the world and showing them off to your friends in this sort of strange little cabinet in your house, as somebody who was really traveled and interesting. And yeah, that we've always been interested in art and trinkets and trying to, I don't know, express ourselves in some way.
Yeah, it's snippets of culture, be they yours or someone else's. They're kind of encoded with a potency that is always interesting to us, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel we've kind of gone off on a wee tangent, which has been lovely. But let's go back to sort of, so we've kind of talked about sort of patronage in terms of the church and how people, you know, sort of whistle stop tour kind of way, used it to buy favor, to show their loyalty and support. And then we've kind of touched on, when did artists start to get a little bit of freedom in their expression? And again, that really didn't happen until about the 19th century. And again, until that point, artists kind of worked in, when they were commissioned for different things, they were worked in studios. So you see a lot of things in the National Gallery, it'll be studio of Rubens, or commissioned, or like after Van Dyck, you know. So there's like a weird thing with provenance and people trying to sort of pinpoint what artist or what studio painted what and for what reason. But there seemed to be like essentially sort of 17th, 18th century, there was an increase in terms of merchant classes. So travel opened up, people could sail, people were sort of importing, exporting goods, and it allowed people to very much rise through the ranks of society very rapidly and obtain all these wealths. And this is essentially where cabinets of curiosity came from. People started, you know, commissioning artists to paint memento moris and show hunting scenes, all sorts of things like that. So really, that's kind of drawing all that back in. This is when people start to, wealth kind of diversifies ever so slightly, and they're seen as new wealth, which aristocracy, old money, really, really hated, because there were these people that essentially, you know, 20 years before were, you know, had hardly any money to like lace their boots up, and now they're commissioning beautiful big country mansions to be built and all sorts of things, and filling it with like beautiful ornate things. And in terms of, you know, travel opening up, this is when Orientalism really came in and started like affecting and influencing what was happening in Britain. So there's all sorts of different information now sort of moving in and out of Britain, influencing the art scene, influencing how people live and work. And it's a really exciting time. But what I find really interesting in terms of looking at things in century wise, so like 17th century, you can look at things and that you can really sort of in a nice bow say that's the Baroque period. And then when you move to the 18th century, you have things like Rococo and Neoclassicism, you can tie that up in another bow. And then when you move into the 19th and 20th century, when artists get a bit more freedom and start creating art without necessarily having a buyer there to back it. It's the start of all these amazing movements that start sort of spinning off and happening, and it kind of brings back to what you said earlier about contemporary artists and how they're not restricted by ideas, and how people until this point really were, because they were kind of in a confined,
bound by this systemic structure that's employing them. Yeah, I guess right up to today, where actually I feel like because of the internet, because of technology, everything's disseminated so rapidly that there's no room for an ism. It's already shared.
Yeah.
So it can't. It's like what I was saying about the there being trends within the cave painting that take thousands of years. It's like we're at the polar opposite end of that in terms of scale, where, you know, as soon as something's kind of created and shared, it's kind of reduced.
And there you have it. That is part 1 of the history of art patronage with myself and Will Jarvis from Gertrude. Please do stick around. Part 2 is coming up right this second. If you'd like to get in touch in the meantime about anything that you've heard today, please feel free. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram @joesarthistory. Will's Instagram and email address and link to Gertrude is also in the show notes below, so please make sure that you check that out as well. Part 2 coming right now.